This episode's theme, judgment, is always relative. We have already covered Laozi's profound and complex first chapter in some detail. Many people find it too difficult and abstract. So why discuss something so abstract? To help clarify, let's first categorize the content of Laozi's 81 chapters. Laozi talks about 4 key points. First, the chaos in the world, which takes up about 20% of the text. Second, how to solve this chaos. Laozi introduces a figure called the sage, a ruler who has realized the Tao, and this concept occupies nearly 50% of the text. It explains how the sage cultivates himself and what positive effects his rule brings. The third key point is, what is the Tao? This was discussed in the first chapter and takes up about 20% of Laozi's work. It might seem abstract, but as you become more familiar with it, it will become easier to understand. The remaining part talks about what Laozi means by virtue, with some overlapping concepts that we will explore as we go through each chapter. So, what does chapter 2 of Laozi's Dao De Jing discuss? It talks about the chaos in the world and the idea that human recognition and judgment are always relative. This relativity creates complex issues of desire. In chapter 1, Laozi mentioned nameless and named, which then lead to desireless and with desire. Names are related to cognition. Once you distinguish things, desires naturally arise. Therefore, in chapter 2, Laozi emphasizes that all judgments, whether about facts or values, are relative. For example, human rationality is reflected in our ability to recognize all things. All cognition involves making distinctions, and distinctions are relative. There is east because there is west, south because there is north. Therefore, humans don't need to be self-righteous, overly attached, or let limited knowledge lead to inappropriate desires. This is the key point that Laozi wants to make as always. Let's first read the original text of chapter 2. Original text of chapter 2 of Laozi's Dao De Jing. When all the world knows beauty as beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When all the world knows good as good, there arises the recognition of evil. Therefore, being and non-being give birth to each other. Difficult and easy complete each other. Long and short contrast each other. High and low rest upon each other. Voice and sound harmonize with each other. Front and back follow each other. Thus, the sage manages affairs without action, and teaches without words. All things arise, and he does not turn away from them. He gives them life, but does not take possession of them. He acts but does not rely on his own actions. He accomplishes his task but does not claim credit for it. Because he does not claim credit, his accomplishment remains with him. The first part of this chapter can be interpreted as follows. When everyone in the world knows what beauty is, ugliness comes into being. When everyone knows what good is, evil comes into being. Thus, being and non-being arise together, difficulty and ease form each other, long and short define each other, high and low lean on each other, sound and voice harmonize, and front and back follow one another. Let's first explain the phrase beauty and ugliness. In ancient times, the character ugliness was often used to describe what was opposite to beauty, not in the moral sense of good and evil, as in later interpretations. Similarly, in the second sentence, good is contrasted with not good. Here, we need to understand that beauty is opposed to ugliness, and good is opposed to not good. These are clear value judgments. For example, in primitive societies, no one cared about what was beautiful or ugly. Everyone had a face, and it was enough to recognize each other. Once someone says a certain appearance is beautiful, then anyone who doesn't meet that standard is considered ugly. Similarly, if you establish a standard for goodness, such as someone donating money to an orphanage being called good, then those who don't have the money to donate are deemed not good. This is how good and not good become relative concepts, so beauty and ugliness, good and not good, are relative. Knowing what is beautiful brings ugliness into existence. Knowing what is good brings not good into existence. This is a clear distinction. These are judgments related to human values. Laozi then lists 6 ways we make judgments about objective reality. When we recognize all things, we inevitably make these judgments. For example, the first pair, being and non-being, are mutually dependent. But how do they give birth to each other? First, we must understand that being refers to the tangible, while non-being refers to the intangible. Otherwise, it's impossible to understand how being and non-being give birth to each other. Can non-being give birth to being? Can being give birth to non-being? A flower may wither, but it doesn't cease to exist. It becomes part of the cycle of life. So when Laozi talks about being and non-being, he is referring to the tangible and the intangible, based on human perception. Thus, being and non-being are relative concepts. Similarly, difficulty and ease are relative. For example, when you're in high school, you find middle school math easy. But that ease is only apparent when compared to the difficulty of your current studies. Otherwise, a math problem doesn't inherently have difficulty. It depends on who is solving it. The same applies to long and short. A foot is long compared to an inch. Without the inch, how would you know the foot is long? But compared to a mile, the foot becomes short. Long and short are defined by comparison. High and low are also relative. For example, you might say a mountain is tall, but compared to what? A hill? But even the tallest mountain is low compared to the sky. So, high and low are mutually dependent. Sound and voice also complement each other. In ancient China, they distinguished between three terms: voice, sound, and music. Voice refers to simple sounds made by animals or humans. Sound refers to the arrangement of those voices to convey a particular meaning. In the Chinese character for meaning yi, the top part represents sound, and the bottom part represents voice. So, sound is a higher level of expression than voice, and music is even higher, representing the emotional expression of the heart. Finally, front and back follow each other. You can only know you are at the front if someone is behind you. But no matter how far you walk, someone is always ahead. So determining front and back is also relative. Thus, Laozi presents 8 types of relative judgments. The first 2 are related to values beauty and good, and the remaining 6 being difficulty, length, height, sound, and sequence are judgments of objective reality. Human cognition arises from these judgments. This kind of cognitive activity is called differentiation. Differentiating between beauty and ugliness, good and not good, being and non-being naturally leads to desire. People will always seek what is more recognized or valued. This kind of differentiation easily gives rise to complex desires. Therefore, in Chapter 2, Laozi immediately reminds us that human reason requires names to function. But once names are created, complex desires follow. It is crucial to remember that all distinctions are relative. If you think someone is beautiful or good, then relatively speaking, someone else becomes ugly or not good. Isn't this subjective judgment leading to biased desires? For example, in a beauty pageant, 6 out of the 10 finalists might look the same because they have undergone cosmetic surgery to meet society's standard of beauty. This is a peculiar phenomenon, and its consequences are clearly undesirable. In this episode, we learned that Laozi believed human cognition easily leads to relative judgments. From different angles or under different conditions, the same object can be perceived and measured differently. Understanding this, we can approach things from both positive and negative perspectives, from all sides, to gain a full understanding of their true nature. When making judgments, don't rely on a single standard. Otherwise, you may find yourself trapped in a complex situation, where everyone is chasing what the world considers to be the best. Cognitive activity is inherently based on differentiation, but this can lead to confusion. Laozi emphasizes that many of the problems in human society come from viewing cognition as differentiation. How do we solve this problem? We'll discuss that later. So, in this episode, we learn that human cognition produces relative outcomes. All judgments, whether of value or fact, are relative. Relativity implies interdependence, and one cannot exist without the other. Once we understand this principle, we won't be overly attached to ideas of what is right or good, and we can avoid biased desires. This is what Laozi hopes we understand in Chapter 2. Lastly, Reflect on this. Laozi is not telling us not to make judgments. Instead, he asks that when we distinguish between beauty and ugliness, good and not good, we remember these judgments are relative. Don't be too attached to these distinctions. Instead, try to view the same person or thing from multiple angles. This way, you'll gain a more complete understanding, without biased desires. Do you think this approach can provide useful insights for our lives? I'd love to hear your thoughts.